So I'm Jim. Some of you may know me, some of you may not. So I'm Jim Langley, and I run Nature's Work. And it's an educational consultancy, and I run workshops and training events in the UK and the Alps. And I've just set up this series of webinars because of the situation that we're in. And this one is on alpine flowers and their ecology. I've got a presentation that I'll run through. I've got a co-host as well. So if anyone has any questions to ask during the presentation, then a colleague, Joe Begley, or Mountaineering Joe, he'll field any questions you got through the chat, and he'll let people join as well who are late, or any issues, just message Joe, please. Any questions you have during the event as well, put them on the chat and we can talk about them right at the end. I have got, during this, a couple of interactive quizzes, so it's useful to have a phone or a second device that you can use to play those. And then at the end, I've decided that I'm going to have a little giveaway as well, so there's a couple of prizes to be won right at the very end. So I will just begin my presentation, share my screen. So you should all see that, Joe. Is that all clear?
That's all good.
You cannot move. Okay. So there we go. So alpine flowers and their ecology. So just run through what the talk's going to be about. As I said, it will be about an hour. These aren't rehearsed, so hopefully it will be about that time. We'll look at why alpine plants are so special. We'll also look at different life zones that you get as you go up, climb up higher into the mountains. We'll look at the various ways that plants are adapted to survive in this harsh mountain environment. And then just living in that mountain environment. So how do they cope? How do they live with the stresses? And then there's also something I think is quite interesting, is where the plants have come from. They've all originated from different parts of the world geographically, but have all come to live within the Alps for various reasons, which we'll talk about. So what does make them so special? I mean, these plants, phenomenal diversity, were able to live higher and above where the natural tree line finishes. So it's phenomenal diversity. It's a really harsh, exposed environment, extreme temperatures, strong sunlight, there's drying effects of the wind, and yet they're all able to cope happily with those conditions and reproduce successfully. And I just think they're just, the sheer diversity and the brilliance of their colours and the vibrancy is just quite staggering and amazing. Something else that's amazing is almost all flower groups, so all the different family types, orchids to daisies to buttercups, they're all represented with alpine species within each of those families. So you've almost got a whole complete array of families and diversity expressed in the Alps or in the alpine environment around the world. So things that they have in common. We'll just run through a few of these to begin with. Some striking characteristics that they've got is how diminutive they are. Tiny little flowers that are able to survive, like hugging the ground, absorbing the ground heat. They're avoiding the drying winds, increasing protection from the snow that overlies them so they don't physically get broken. Whereas trees, on the other hand, they've got to grow and reproduce above the ground, in the air, and that may be one of their limiting factors. We'll talk about the tree line in a bit, but there's a point where the trees haven't got this ability to survive. But this diminutive size is one of the features common to a lot of the alpine flowers. Something else that's really important, I think, is the fact that plants have converged through evolution to look alike. So unrelated plants actually look very similar. So if we look at the two plants you've got there, King of the Alps and Alpine rock jasmine, very unrelated families, and yet their physical appearance in the flower size and the shape of the flowers and the whole morphology, the shape of the plant, it's like it's been shaped, or they've been shaped by the harsh environment, which has put these selective pressures on the plants to make them look and grow in a certain way. King of the Alps, for instance, is related to borage. So it's in the borage family. Green alkanet is out in the meadows and fields and in the UK at the moment. Forget-me-nots as well. So they're all from the same family. And yet that green alkanet looks very unsimilar to the shape and of the King of the Alps. And the rock jasmine is related to a primrose. So loosestrifes as well, and pimpernels, they're all in that family. So if you look at the lowland species, the primroses and the borages, they're so different. So that environmental pressure has created this genetic adaptation, really, bringing the plants to look very similar. And I think that's quite an interesting point with alpine flowers. Something else that's really common to alpine flowers is they've got a huge extensive root network. So roots are really important for anchorage. They store water and sugars, and they just gather the minerals that are essential for the plants from the soil. And the soils in the mountains are very thin, and they don't really have a great nutrition. So big roots are really important. You've also got very active environments, like scree habitats are very mobile. So having a big extensive root system is really important for the plant survival. They offer stability and storage of water and sugars and so on again. So small plants like you see there can have, maybe in terms of the mass of the leaves and the flowers, you can have 4 times the amount of mass underground in the roots. So it's a huge amount of material that they've got underground, anchoring and bringing all the nutrients in, which is very common in alpine flowers, but very unusual in kind of lowland species. There's a species of bellflower there, has a root network of 8.5 meters. So a small plant that you see there, 8.5 meter capacity. It's a huge network of roots. And from that central flower, or that cluster, the roots will spread out about 70 centimeters. So scientists have been out and they've traced this. So there's a huge, wide network of roots there. Grasses, for instance, have roots which can spread up to 3 meters as well. So, you know, it's some big kind of record breakers really in the underground root structure really, or the capacity to, you know, draw in the nutrients and things. Picture of moss campion there. It's a really important plant. I'll come back to it a few times through the talk, and it's a classic cushion forming plant. They have deep tap roots. So there's an image I've pulled from a research paper, and that shows the small above ground cushion, but then extensive. Common to all campions is that deep, big taproot. They're essential. That's one of the first things they form, the deep root. Then they start to grow out from that, but they can spread out this huge network of roots from there. To form a network like that takes a long time. And that's another feature really common to alpine flowers, is the longevity, their life expectancy. There's very, very few plants which only survive for 1 year, an annual plant. There's just a handful of species. In the Arctic, there are no annual plants. The physical environment itself is too demanding and too extreme, really, for a lot of these flowers to actually cope with. They've got to set seed, they've got to grow, they've got to flower, and all of that, and germinate, all of that, all within a very short growing season, because the climate's so extreme. So to do all that is probably one of the biggest limiting factors. So a long life is a much better strategy. And trailing azalea, we see an image there, grows to about 110 years. It's it's got woody, and it grows just by spreading shoots. Alpine rose, there's an image in the corner there, lives to around 200 years. and cowberry there grows to about 140 years. So there are some very long-lived plants there. Go back to Moss Campion. It's a great plant. It's spectacular, and two, it's got so many fascinating facets to it, which are really good for a kind of teaching purpose. The plant I took a photo of there is probably about 1/2 meter wide. That's about 100 years old. So it grows at about 4 to 5 millimeters per year. So that one's about 1/2 meter, so it's about 100 years old. There has been an example or an individual in the Italian Alps. I read a record, 1.8 meters wide, one individual, this big cushion, so it's 6 foot wide, estimated at 300 years old. So these plants are incredibly long-lived. Another interesting fact with Moss Campion is it's known as a compass plant. So if you're not sure which is south, which is north, the flowers always appear on the southern side of that cushion forming plant before the north. So that's always a good indicator for kind of navigational purposes, or test it next time you're in the Alps. And it's not just the physical plant and looking at the roots and the aging, but the names allude to this longevity. So you've got the house leeks, which are known in Latin as sempervivum. Not very good at pronouncing Latin names, which means always living. And then you've got plants like live long saxifrage, which again indicate this longevity. As I said, I would talk about the tree line a little bit more. This phenomenon where you've got in that image there, you've got this natural tree line in the Alps, and then above it, you've got grasslands, you've got various species, thin soil, but this is where the flowers live. There's something like that, 600 alpine flowers in the Alps. And it's not really fully understood why there is this tree line exists, but one theory is, and it's a common theory that's accepted now, it's called growth limitation. So the trees are actually photosynthesizing, laying down new material from the sun's energy. But then the enzymes, there's just not enough time or not enough ability for them to actually make products within the plant for that. A bit like a builder on a building site. You've got the blocks, you've got the sand and cement, but it's just too cold for the builder to put them all together. And it's that kind of concept that is one of the more later theories as to why there is this natural tree line. But in this diagram here, we've got, it just illustrates, I couldn't simplify it anymore. You've got the different aspects of north and south, and then you've got these schematic altitudes. Where you are in the Alps, these kind of layers or these altitudinal zones will vary with the absolute climate of where you are in the Central Alps and northern, more continental the Alps are, Southern Alps as well. So, but the idea is that we get these zones, and they're climatic zones. You get them all over the world. In the Arctic, it's so cold that the tundra is the natural vegetation at sea level, can't support tree growth, but you've got these Arctic species, very similar to the Alpine species, that grow at sea level. And then you go to the other extreme, which is the tropics, where you've got forests much higher in elevation. So the climate dictates what these zones are. That is taken from a book. I will just jump in and just mention that is taken from a book which a colleague and I wrote and was published in the autumn. So Paul Gannon and I wrote that, and that's from that book. The publishers put that together. So just have a look at the different altitude zone. So the high alpine zone really is the absolute limit for where life can be reached, and only a few plant species survive here. There's a lack of soil. Soil's critical. We won't talk a lot about the geology in this talk, but soil's really important. Up there's hardly anything. So the lichens are really at in their element in those high. They're drought-loving plants, so they're drought tolerant. They're able to survive the meager rations. Their spores can be carried and transferred very long distances. So they're what you can say are true alpine pioneers. There is a plant, the purple saxifrage, which has the high altitude record of a flowering plant in the Alps, and it's just under 4,500 meters in the Mischabel. So it's on, I think it's found near the summit on the Dom in the Swiss Alps. So that's, I don't know, it's a small cluster of flowering plants. So they're viable at that altitude. So that's a phenomenal height for a plant to get to. It's also the purple saxifrage is also the most northerly flowering plant in the world in Greenland. So it's truly hardy alpine plant. Slightly lower zone, alpine zone. So this is, call it 2,500 meters to 3,200 meters. It's above the natural tree line. Highly specialized hardy species, which we'll talk more about in a bit. The soil's still not fully formed. You get dwarf shrubs that carpet, some grassland species, many large herbs and shrubs. You've got the odd tree there, but they're, if anything, you're at above that level for the trees. You might get the outline Norway spruce. But the soil's forming, and that's what's important. There you have a picture of the spring pasque flower. Coming down slightly into the subalpine zone, this runs up to the upper tree limit. It's a highly rich, flower diverse area. You can see spring crocuses there. There's a mixture of mountain species and lowland species. Again, the soil's much richer, more developed, and so it can support a greater variety of less hardy species. Coming down another layer, so we're about 1,000 to 1,500 meters. So you've got these tall herb meadows, these alpine pastures, and high humidity, high rainfall. Broadleaf trees such as beech and sycamore. So not just the conifers now, we're starting to get a lot of human impacts as well. Lots of management, but they're that's the classic. If you're trekking through the Alps, it's at that level that you're spending a lot of your time. So it's a joy to be in with all the diversity there. And then just at the lower level than that, we've got the sub-montane zone. And here there's greater management, greater, richer soils. And if you get a chance to see plants like the lady slipper orchid, absolutely, I've seen them a couple of times in the Alps. They're not common, but where you find them, you do get like swathes of them in wet, damp, base-rich river woodlands and things like that. So that's a photo from Switzerland, but I've seen them in the Dolomites as well. So that just a little summary of the different altitudinal zones. In terms of life forms, I had mentioned a few things before. I mentioned the spore-bearing plants like the lichens. Now we've got club mosses and lichens and ferns. They all have spores, and those spore-bearing plants are a characteristic of the mountain environment and the alpine environment. So they're a life form that is worth kind of categorizing, really, and that's what we're doing with this now, looking at life forms. It's just the different categories of flowers that we get in the Alps. I did mention earlier about annuals. There are very, very few species of annuals, but a beautiful flower that you'll get in July, August, late July is the snow gentian. So it's a high alpine flower. And I did some research and found out it only lives for a year, this annual. So it's got just a matter of maybe 3 months, 2 to 3 months of growing season. So it's got to germinate, put up leaves, it's got to throw the flowers out, it's got to then fertilize those, and it's got to set the seed all within the year, and then it dies come September time. So it's a risky strategy, but plants do it, and but not very common. Perennial herbs are far more common. So a herb is a plant without wood. So it's a non-woody herbaceous plant. Perennial, they live for a long time. An example there, Alpine columbine. So much more abundant, very dominant life form. grasses fall into that category as well. So they're perennial herbs, non-woody, and there's just two examples there. In terms of woody plants, we've got examples like bearberry, crowberry, or the heathers, for instance. So they lay down wood. So the shrubs are woody, so they can live a long time, as well as we spoke about earlier. Dwarf Alpine rose as well. So that's a very, very brief look at the different life forms that you can categorize the alpine flowers under. There's lots of categories, but they're ones that I think are quite useful, so that we if we're trying to identify a flower, we can think, oh right, well, it's a woody plant, or it's this, or it's that, and you know, and then it helps us in our identification. I've got a little interactive quiz now, a Kahoot. So if you have a phone ready, some of you have played these before. It's all about flavorings of alpine spirits. So some of you may know some of these. On your phone, if you can just open a browser and type in kahoot.it, it will then prompt you to enter a code. So kahoot.it, and the code 386689. 5 questions, non-competitive, it's just a bit of fun. So you use your phone to submit your answer. There'll be 4 answers, possible answers. The quicker you answer, the more points you get. But there's no prizes in this, it's just a bit of fun. There'll be another one of these towards the end of the presentation as well. So I'm going to start there. Players can still join in, and there's another one in a bit. So, Alpine liqueurs. Are you ready? Aperol is an Italian bitter aperitif made with which alpine flower? And the answer was a gentian. There we go. I have a lot of fun finding out all these questions as well. Well done, Jacques. Jenepe, traditional alpine liqueur. What's its flavour? There's a picture of it there as well to help. Absinthe is also made with this plant, a lowland species, alpine species. Jenepe wormwood, spiked wormwood. So well done, yet. A lot of you know your alpine flavourings. Brian, well done there. Jägermeister, German digestive. Which berries? The juniper berries. Lots of spices in that. They're very medicinal. There's quite a few of these medicinal aperitifs or digestives. Well done, Julia, picking into the lead. Zerbenz, an Austrian liqueur, flavoured and coloured by the young cones of an alpine tree. There's a picture of the tree, so that might be a bit of a clue if you're not sure. Alpine, or the Arolla, stone pine. I'm not sure if the others are all edible anyway, or you can flavour, but it's the Arolla stone pines there. Rebecca, well done. And then the final question, which part of the great yellow gentian plant are used Gentian schnapps. It's the main part of the plant. It's basically medicinal, the only bit that's really used of this plant. So I don't know if you can eat other parts of it, but there's one bit which contains lots of bitter compounds. And it is the roots. So I don't know if the other parts are edible, but the roots definitely have been used for thousands of years as a medicinal plant. So, in third place, 3 out of 5. Julia, well done. Silver's good, well done. But the winner is Rebecca. Super, well done. Great, I hope you enjoyed that. And we'll get back on with the second part of the presentation. And then we'll run into another one of those towards the end as well. Yeah, so I'll put that picture up there because it shows a lot about the mountain or the alpine environment. You can see there's lots of late snow lying in the area, but the solar radiation, the sun's energy has been melting the snow on the southern aspects, where the northern aspects you've got lots of snow cover. So you've got green vegetation here, but you've got different environments. So plants that are living under all this snow will have less growing season, but they will be protected from the harsh environment. Imagine you're a flower, you're living up on the ridge up here, for instance, or you're up on the mountainside up here. The environment that you see there is very different. So plants have adapted to live under different conditions. And so there are some kind of striking adaptations that you get in alpine flowers. One of them, I just think, is quite common. It's a lot common than I've been reading more about this, but a preformed flower, the bud. Normally in the springtime, the kind of stalk would appear and the flower bud would then appear, and then it would burst open in the springtime. But in the Alps, and especially with snowbed species, like that's a dwarf snowbell from the east of the Alps. There's also the Alpine snowbell, which is more common, but that was a photo from the east. Those form the buds at the end of the summer, so that when they're being overlain with snow, they've got an advantage where they've got a shorter growing season because they're covered by snow. But as the snow starts to melt, these buds pick up energy from the sun, and they actually start metabolizing and melting the snow around them, and they form a little hole around through the snow, and then they pop up, and so they've got the fantastic adaptation and advantage to a very short growing season by preforming the flowers. And there's lots and lots of species that I've been reading that do this. I thought it was just in snowbed species, but alpine species on the whole, there's a lot of this that goes on. So yeah, it's a great phenomenon. I couldn't really not talk about the iconic Edelweiss here. It's a phenomenal plant that goes up to about 3,400 meters. It's a true alpine specialist, and it's covered in this most amazing felty hair. So that image might be a little bit small. It looks probably a little bit fuzzy and out of focus, but it's not. It's just these little flower heads, these clusters of flowers are covered in little hairs, and these bracts here are just grey and felty. The stems are felty, the leaves are felty. So there's a great adaptation to having, or to being hairy. Prevents it insulates. It helps in the seed development, so it keeps it nice and warm. It also helps with drought tolerance as well, and protects from the sun and the harsh winds. And they may also have a function in helping to focus ultraviolet rays down onto the leaves as well. I don't know, there's some evidence about the way that light refracts through them, or it's brought in. So there might be an adaptation with hairs to do with ultraviolet. radiation. But certainly they're great. It's a great adaptation and quite a common adaptation as well. Other things you find in alpine flowers are big, thick, fleshy leaves. So the little holes on a leaf where the water moves in and out as well. You have a reduced number of those holes called stomata, but that and the fleshy leaf, it's kind of reduced the surface to volume ratio, so it protects the leaves from drying out and various other effects. So fleshy leaves are a great adaptation. I mentioned Moss campion earlier as one of these cushion forming plants. There's quite a number of cushion forming plants. This one's Vandelli rock jasmine, quite an unusual one. Grows, looking at the rock there, it's on a granite, so it's a real silica loving or a non-calcium loving environment that it's in. They have a phenomenal adaptation to kind of avoiding strong winds. Again, a cushion plant there, it's grown from one individual, so it's a clone, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but it's a clone of one flower that's just grown into this rock crevice in a little niche, and it's tightly packed. It forms a beautiful moist environment beneath it. It can extract water from the crevice, and it maintains a nice moist environment. And plants like that can be, I know they've recorded Moss campion, put a thermometer inside, and it can be 10 degrees warmer inside the cushion than outside. So it's a really nice, moist, warm environment. So it's, it's their perfect adaptation in some environments that some plants kind of have adapted to create that life form. Also, frost tolerance. Performing metabolic functions at low temperatures is a real great advantage in the mountains. It does cost a lot more to be able to perform at low temperatures, but it gives you an advantage over plants that can't do it. So some plants have an ability to freeze or to lower their freezing point, so their cells don't freeze up. They convert starch into sugars, and sugars being soluble will just maintain a liquid state rather than being frozen. A bit like the way that we would salt a road to lower the freezing point. So adding a solute like that would lower the freezing point, so it can still perform. So that's a great adaptation. Others have kind of oil, which doesn't freeze at the same temperature. That so there are different mechanisms that plants use. Basically, heading towards frost tolerance. Plants can supercool because of this, but the cold is also a problem because they need to function, and especially with a very low, short growing season of maybe 2 to 3 months, whereas you might have lowland areas 7 to 9 months growing season. So they're really a disadvantage. And plants generally can only photosynthesize above zero, above freezing. But plants like we see there, glassy crowfoot, have an ability to photosynthesize at -6. So it's not just a frost tolerance to survive, but it's actually able to photosynthesize at such cold temperatures, which is quite an amazing adaptation. That's one of the high altitude flowers that you get in the Alps. And then succulents. Lots of moist or water storing structures in the leaves and the roots, in the stems and such. So succulent plants like there's a plant, dark stonecrop it's called. They're drought tolerant. They live on sun-baked rocks, very dry environments. So the wind and the sun dry these environments very quickly. Being succulent is a great advantage. We're going to move on from adaptations to reproduction, because there's some really interesting ways that plants reproduce. And in the mountains, they've really adapted quite phenomenally to this. So successful reproduction is the aim of all living organisms. producing sexual reproduction, producing genetic variations in offspring, allow the new species, or that species, to adapt to new environmental conditions. And it, in a way, it gives you an evolutionary advantage through natural selection over the long term. So pollinators exist, flies, bees, butterflies, wasps, all sorts of organisms exist, but high in the mountains, the number of pollinators, the environment itself, is quite harsh, higher wind. So the diversity and the numbers of these pollinators is less than there are in the lowlands. And yet flowers have adapted, and this is what I love about alpine flowers. They've got these wonderful, huge, a lot of them are parabolic flowers that you see there, like on the Alpine poppy, and it's really hard for them, and it's a lot of energy that goes into sexual reproduction. There's a lot of waste that goes with it, with producing pollens and ovaries. But there's this mechanism by which the drive to reproduce sexually is, so important that they spend a huge amount of energy. Yet it's at a cost to the plant to be able to do that. So the benefits must outweigh the costs, or they wouldn't do it, producing these great big showy flowers. They have lots, in here there's lots of stamen with lots and lots of pollen, so that's a huge waste. You only need one of those pollen grains to land on an ovule there for, to produce, germinate and to have an offspring. But you've got hundreds of ovules and lots of pollen. So there's using the bees and the pollinators must be a very beneficial method. It's very focused as well. Tracking the sun is important. It heats up the ovule. It helps lots of the functions, as that Alpine moon days there will track the sun, and the parabolic shape of the poppy will focus the sun's energy. So it will help in this short growing season, help with the development of that seed, and in that whole process of sexual reproduction. But it's not just showy flowers. You've also got lots of wind pollinated plants, lots of grasses, and that strategy, they just inundate the area. I get hay fever, I get a lot of grass pollen, so there's lots of grass pollen that just are just shed every year in the hope that it will land and sexually fertilize a flower, and then that's another adaptation, less specific but also less costly in developing those great big flowers that we see there. But what's really interesting is now the non-sexual ways that plants reproduce, and they've adapted to live in the Alps and to reproduce without sex. And there's some really novel ways. Some plants have an amazing way to do this. I'm taking cuttings at the moment from plants in the garden. So plants will naturally, you can take a fragment of a plant, a clone, essentially. It's an exact replica of the parent. Vegetative propagation. If you're gardeners, you'll know more about this than I will. But they make a fragment. So plants making a clone of themselves may have the advantage of not spending the energy reproducing sexually and making these great big flowers, but there is a cost at some level, because the ability to adapt to a new environment, if you're creating a clone, it might not help with a long-term evolution or a survival strategy. But there are different types of grasses that we get, or the allies of grasses. So we get tussock forming clones, so we get tussock grasses, and those make little fragments called ramites that form from that central tussock, and as it grows out, they form this great big clump rather than spreading across a meadow. So you get these fantastic classic tussock forming grasses. So the new individual is attached through the roots to the parent. So that plant there that we see is just one individual And this again down here, this is a type of cotton grass, a sedge. So instead of producing these little fragments of these rametes, they produce underground stems that spread. So the plants are here, and then the underground stems will come under this water here, and then producing a new shoot that will have a root. So they're connected to the parent, but they're spread out with these runners or these stolons. Plants like this, we talked about longevity. Some grasses, because they reproduce clonally, can survive maybe 1,000 years. So there's some great longevity in some of these grasses, but no individual of that grass. So these individuals may die, but these younger clones will survive and grow on. So that plant survived hundreds of years perhaps, but no individual is made in more than 15 years. But it's an interesting adaptation and survival strategy. Rhizomes, modified stems which live underground, and they produce a root and a shoot, which is known as a rootstock. So a great example of a rhizome is if you've got a bit of root ginger in your kitchen, and you put that in a bit of water, or you leave it in the cupboard too long, then it will produce a little shoot from that rootstock. So that's a rhizome, and rhizomatic growth happens from that. So that example there is mountain everlasting, which produces offsprings or clones from a rhizome. We also have tuft forming plants. So a tuft is very similar to the tussock, but tussocks generally we talk about grasses, but tufts, we get the same kind of principle where an individual is connected to the parent plant and forming this small tuft. And that is Mount Cenis bellflower, and that's a high altitude plant. That's about 2,500 to 2,800 meters high that photo was taken. So it's all those high alpine plants. And then we have mats. So in a way, and again, they have these roots, and we'll see a little diagram there, these runners, and they are stolons. If you think of if you're growing strawberries at home, and you've got the overground runner, and then that produces the root and the shoot. So that is essentially a stolon, but mats grow in that way. So that's Alpine willow herb. That's a great colonizing pioneer species, this example here. Okay, so they're non-sexual clonal growth. Other ways that plants reproduce, the vivipary, which is a phenomenal adaptation. Plants like Alpine bistorte use their flowers, interestingly enough, they will, at low levels, will use their flowers to reproduce sexually, but they also produce these baby plantlets. So they produce baby plants without fertilization. That baby plantlet falls to the ground and produces a clone of the parent. As you go up through, at lowlands, they will, in gardens, for instance, they will pollinate. But when you're in the Alps or the high altitude, they will only reproduce without sex. So they only produce with these bulbils. And you can see the plants here, they're dominated by that, and there's very few flowers. They can still produce flowers, and you'll see them like that in the high alpine areas in the meadows, but they will only reproduce non-sexually. Other examples are alpine meadowgrass, which instead of producing seed, they produce a baby plant with roots, and then they fall to the ground as a clone of their parent. So it's another giving birth to live offspring or young, so vivipary. So fantastic adaptation. Then there's this thing which is really quite unusual, called apomixis. And it's basically where the seed develops but without pollination. So it's an unfertilized seed. Basically, the plant is disguising sexual reproduction, but it produces an identical offspring. So that's alpine lady's mantle. And these alpine ladies' mantles, or ladies' mantles in general, will only reproduce this method. So evolution in the long term, adaptations, I don't know, their ability to adapt to new environments may be affected by that, but in abundance. They're very successful, but they produce apomixically. Mountain everlasting will do this exclusively as well. But there are plants that are common to us that do this sometimes when they can be bothered or when they don't, when the conditions are right. So things like brambles will do it, hawthorns do it, dandelions do it, but not exclusively. These two examples will only reproduce non-sexually with that method. The final section I was going to talk about on the flowers themselves, before we go into a little quiz at the end, were the origins of the alpine flowers. So the Alps are relatively young. They began their formation about 100 million years ago, geologically very young during the tertiary period. So this is a schematic view of how the world would have looked. It's a very different picture. The Alps were forming from a bit of North Africa pushing up into the European plate. We were very close to Greenland and North America. So from a non-geological point of view, we're looking at the origins of flowers. So when I'll talk about different flowers coming from different parts of the world, the important story is plate tectonics. And as these mountains have grown, a lot of limestone and marine sediments have been forced up and above the sea. So, you know, you climb some limestone mountains, and this is where the limestone will be formed in this oceanic sea floor environment. Then as Africa pushed up, it got lifted above the ground, and then we've got all the limestone. We've also got, in the last 2.5 million years, in the Pleistocene era, we've had various ice ages, glaciations, advances and retreats of ice. So that's allowed the movement and the passage of flowers along the edge of these kind of advancing glaciers. And then as the glaciers fill the valleys, maybe these flowers become isolated above the glaciers, and then they become separate species over time. Others you can find them common throughout the Alps. So there's a really interesting kind of evolution and kind of development of alpine flowers that have come from different parts of the world. The quiz in a minute, the Kahoot, is going to be based on the origins of flowers, just as another way of looking at it. So there's species that have come from Central Asia, across the steppes, across the massifs, the kind of Balkans, but following the edge of glaciers, the movement into the Alps have come. Plants like Edelweiss, there's 50 plus species of Edelweiss in Central Asia, in the Himalayas, whereas there's only one species in the Alps, although there are ecologists that like to split them down and say, well, actually there's 4 subspecies of it. But I'm more of a grouper, so I say there's one species and there's 50 odd species where they've originated from. Other plants that have come from Central Asia, things like Alpine rose, primroses, gentians, and columbines, the aquilegia that you get in your garden, they're Central Asia in origin. You've also got vegetation which have been brought into the Alps from North Africa and the Mediterranean basin. Things like bellflowers, campions, crocus, we saw a photo of the crocus earlier, and then that flower there, which has got beautiful purple and an orange striking colour, the Alpine toadflax. So those plants have come from North Africa in origin. We've got those which have come from North America with these land bridges. The example there is arnica, so the medicinal flower, a medicinal plant, has come with bearberry, and it's come with Alpine aster and goldenrods. Then we've got a whole assemblage of flowers which have originated, they've come down from the edge of the glaciers from Scandinavia. So thinking about what you might find in the UK, if you're in the UK, some of those species are saxifrages, like the species there is white musky saxifrage, a high alpine saxifrage. Mountain avens, glacier crowfoot, those species have known to have got a Scandinavian origin. But then there are flowers which have come from the Alps themselves. They've originated in the Alps, they're not found anywhere else, and they're endemic to the Alps. So these are evolved within the Alps. That example there is blue spiked rampion. So rampions are only found in the Alps, as are snowbells, adenostylls, and some around 400 endemic alpine species in the Alps. So it's just, I find it really interesting to know where things have come from, the origins of things. So it just shows the power of geographical isolation or tectonic plates and uplift and that process to bring everything together in the great diversity that we have there. We're going to go to where in the world now. So there's 5 questions. Some of them are true and false. Some of them, there's 5 questions. And there is a picture. So once the question's read out, if you're not quite sure, there is a picture, which may help. But if you can sign into Kahoot again, so www.kahoot.it, we'll load up. And we'll get the game pin now, which is 615845. Flower girl. I'll just give it a few more minutes. That's 38, 39. People can join as we go through. So I think we'll make a start there. So where in the world? True or false? Snowbells are endemic to the Alps. I might just give them that one away. They are endemic, so that's one of those few examples I just mentioned there. Smiling camel, well done. Can you identify the Scandinavian plant? 8 petals and a leaf like an oak leaf. Latin name is Dryas octopetala. Mountain avens, yeah. Good knowledge there. Well done, Brian. True or false? Bellflowers come from North Africa. Correct. Kirst, well done. You're on fire. You got more right. That looks nice. Well done. Alpine rose originates from which geographical region? Same place as the Edelweiss. Not sure. Correct, Central Asia. Brian's regained the lead. Last question. There is a chance to win some cards after this, not during this. So the snow lily grows in the North American Rockies. We're very precious about this in North Wales. Is it found other places in the world? Not an easy one, but it is true. We're very precious about it in the UK, but it's in the Rockies, it's in Mongolia, it's in the Alps. So well done, 5 out of 5. Becky, well done for that. And another one, Brian, well done. But the winner is Smiling Camel. You started the winner and you finished. So well done. And Nairi and Helen, runners up. Well done. So I'm just going to wrap up in a couple of slides I know some of you may have been on these webinars before, but some of you will be new to them. I've created some Alpine flower cards, but I ran a competition a few weeks ago as to what you could do with them, because there's so much learning that we can do. We can use them as a set of cards, but we can just use them as a learning resource. But say you had a set of these. I've got a whole series of activities which you can download for free off the website. Game of Guess Who. So if you want to learn more about Alpine flowers, you can stick them on your head and only ask yes or no questions, or questions with yes and no answers to know what it is that you've got. You play Snap. You could do Snap with flower families. It doesn't have to be just the 2 packs of cards. You could go, have they Snap with a colour, or whatever you want to play. So there's lots of ways that you could be resourceful or innovative with that. Or Pelmanism, matching pairs. Again, looking for pairs of families, or maybe names, or all sorts of things you can play, that kind of those kind of games. But there's a whole series of those on my website you can download as PDF. So I'm just going to show you the range of these. I've got them all in stock now, so they can be purchased. Also, I have a book on the Alps. I will share this presentation with you afterwards, so if there's anything you'd like to recap, then I'm happy to share this with you all on the Google Slides afterwards. Ways of staying in touch. So these webinars seem to have got some momentum and been quite popular. So next week I've got one at the same time on trees in Britain, and then my colleague, who's the co-author of the Alps book, is going to talk about the mountains of Britain, a geological story. And then my wild food and foraging was quite popular and people couldn't make it, and I may well do a rerun of that in June. Things with different foods will be out in June as well. So I do have, hopefully we'll get back into the mountains and I'll be able to run workshops. So you can stay in touch through the website. And now I'm going to play a Wheel of Fortune. I've entered all your names into a Wheel of Fortune, and I've got a pack of Alpine trump cards and a pack of playing cards to be won. So if you're the winner, if you would just send me your postal address, that's all. So it's going to hopefully work. It's going to spin your name completely at random. So here's a chance for you to win a little takeaway prize. Mara, what? Ooh, yeah, Mara, well done. Well done. So you've won a set of the playing cards, and we'll do one more now. And for the Alpine trump cards, the lucky winner is Richard. That was a tight one. Richard, well done. There we go. I think I often end my webinars with some feedback. I love to get instant feedback from you. And again, if you've got access to your phone, if you could just type in menti.com. There's 3 slides with questions. The code is 43772. And I'll just get a quick feel for what your thoughts are about this webinar today. 7 o'clock, so it's an hour just. So again, I can share this feedback with you. Da iawn, bendigedig, diolch. Enjoyable, fun, interesting, useful, awesome, fab, challenging. I'm sorry, it's a lot of science that comes in, and it's trying to be simple, but also explaining the ecology of things. So yeah, hopefully it was challenging, but you found it really enjoyable. And then the next slide, ratings. Thank you. so far, 12 people there. And then I just want to see how to interact. It's really difficult to interact and to know some common flowers for ID, Baymore points. If I can, I have to speak to mountain training because they're not sure I can add it, but if I can, I will. Would love to put this into practice in the Alps. More tea and biscuits, a virtual biscuit coming to everyone. Yeah, so I'm sure comments will come in. Some tastes, yeah, some gin would be nice. Alpine flower families. Maybe I could do one on flower families, Alpine flower families. I know I was trying to get across the whole concept of living in the mountains and things. But yeah, looking at features of those. Names and all the pictures. Yeah, if you are not sure of any of those pictures, you can always ask and I will happily let you know what they all were. Okay, so I'll just have a look at those and I can again share those. I often share them on Facebook after these events. But yes, I can share any of that feedback with you if you'd like to just email me at all. So I'm going to stop sharing now. So I hope you found that useful, interesting, and I'll just have a chance to look at all that afterwards. But were there any, Joe, were there any questions that popped up on the chat at all?
Not particularly. No, just a few thank yous and code requests, but no, okay. No particular questions.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all very much. I've just run over a little bit. These are kind of new things for me. Mara and Richard, wasn't it? So yeah, let me know your addresses and I'll pop them in the post to you. Thank you very much for attending and taking part, and hopefully we'll see you virtually and maybe in flesh as well in the future. So thank you and have a lovely evening.